From New York, this is Democracy Now!
You need to get vaccinated when it becomes available as quickly and as expeditiously as possible throughout the country. And the reason for that is that there is a fact that permeates virology, and that is that viruses cannot mutate if they don't replicate.
As the U.S. COVID death toll tops 450,000, the Biden administration's attempting to ramp up its vaccination campaign to slow the spread of new coronavirus variants. We'll speak to Dr. Wafa El-Sadr of Columbia University on why the U.S. should be doing more to help supply the world with COVID vaccines, just like it once did with HIV medication. Then we look at China's crackdown on Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities in Xinjiang province as reports emerge of mass rapes and sweeping surveillance.
In order to understand the camps, the surveillance system, all of the forms of oppression that are going on in Northwest China, we have to understand the deeper history, the economic drivers behind the system, the way that oil and natural gas brought settlers into the area, and how it's now bringing factories into the area to put Uyghurs to work in unfree labor conditions. The surveillance system is collecting data from these people, and it's building new technologies, new tools that can then be adapted to other uses.
We'll speak to anthropologist Darren Byler and the Uyghur linguist and poet Abdueli Ayub, who was once detained for 15 months for running a Uyghur language kindergarten in Xinjiang, China. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. A congressional watchdog is blasting the former Trump administration over its disastrous handling of the pandemic, with auditors saying they were left deeply troubled by their review of the federal government's failures. In a 346-page report, the General Accounting Office says 90% of its recommendations remained unimplemented just before Trump left office. The report came as the U.S. death toll from COVID-19 tops 450,000, with over 3,900 deaths reported on Wednesday alone. Centers for Disease Control Director Dr. Rochelle Walensky said Wednesday people should get vaccinated as soon as possible to prevent new coronavirus variants from causing a fresh surge in cases.
We have seen declines in cases and admissions and a recent slowing of deaths. Cases remain extraordinarily high, still twice as high as the peak number of cases over the summer. And the continued proliferation of variants that likely have increased transmissibility, that spread more easily, threatens to reverse these recent trends.
CDC Director Walensky also said the vaccination of teachers is not a prerequisite for safe reopening of schools. It's a position that's drawn fire from teachers' unions nationwide. On Wednesday, Baltimore City Schools announced a 2-week delay to its plans to expand in-person learning after students and parents joined teachers in a car caravan protest at Baltimore City Hall, demanding stronger safety measures, including that all staff members be fully vaccinated. President Biden's pick to become Secretary of Education received a warm reception on Capitol Hill Wednesday. Connecticut Public Schools Commissioner Miguel Cardona told a Senate committee he favors reopening schools during the pandemic with science-driven guidance from the CDC. He also pushed back at Republican Senator Dr. Rand Paul, saying transgender students should be allowed to participate in sports based on gender identity.
So you don't have a problem then with boys running in the girls' track meet, swimming meets, name it. You're okay then with boys competing with girls?
Respectfully, Senator, I think I answered the question. I believe schools should offer the opportunity for students to engage in extracurricular activities, even if they're transgender. I think that's their right.
Meanwhile, President Biden's nominee to lead the Environmental Protection Agency told a Senate panel Wednesday he would restore science and transparency at the EPA while working to address the urgent threat of climate change. If confirmed, Michael Regan would be the first black man to lead the EPA. The Senate's reached a power-sharing agreement that'll see Democrats in the evenly divided chamber control Senate committees and set their agendas. Republicans will hold an equal number of seats on each committee. Democratic Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said Wednesday he's ordered incoming Democratic committee chairs to start holding hearings on the climate crisis in preparation for passing major climate legislation from every committee. The House of Representatives votes today on whether to strip Georgia Republican Congressmember Marjorie Taylor Greene of her assignments on the House Education and Budget Committees over her history of violent threats, promoting dangerous conspiracy theories, and racist anti-Muslim and anti-Semitic comments. On Wednesday, Greene reportedly apologized for some of her past comments during a closed-door Republican caucus meeting. She received a standing ovation after concluding her remarks. Afterwards, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy told reporters he condemned Greene's comments but said he would not strip Greene of her committee assignments or punish her in any other way.
I denounce all those comments that were brought up. Everybody, and she came to she came inside our conference and denounced them as well. She said she was wrong.
Mother Jones reports Congressmember Greene served as a moderator for a Facebook page that championed the John Birch Society and routinely featured death threats and bigoted attacks against Democrats. Greene has repeatedly claimed the Parkland massacre and other mass shootings like Sandy Hook were false flag operations staged to crack down on gun rights. NBC News reports that in one 2019 interview with the gun owners group, Greene mocked Parkland, Florida high school shooting survivor David Hogg as an idiot who only talks when he's scripted, she said. House Ethics Committee Chair Ted Deutsch of Florida, whose district includes Parkland, responded Wednesday.
The families are still grieving, as are the communities of Sandy Hook and Las Vegas, and too many more to name. There are not words in the English language to properly describe how the remarks of Ms. Greene makes these communities feel. They are still suffering. They will suffer forever.
Marjorie Greene has called for the execution of Democratic leaders like Nancy Pelosi and President Obama. Nearly 400 congressional aides have signed a public letter calling on the Senate to convict Donald Trump for inciting the violent mob that attacked the Capitol on January 6th. It's a rare case of congressional staffers publicly airing their own views. In the letter, the aides describe hiding under chairs and desks, barricading themselves in their offices, and fleeing for their lives. They're calling on senators to bar Trump from ever running for office again, writing, quote, "Our Constitution only works when we believe in it and defend it. It's a shared commitment to equal justice, the rule of law, and the peaceful resolution of our differences. Any person who doesn't share these beliefs has no place representing the American people now or in the future," they wrote. Federal agents have arrested Ethan Nordine, the self-described sergeant-at-arms of Seattle's chapter of the far-right Proud Boys organization, charging him with helping to lead the mob of rioters who attacked the Capitol January 6th. CNN reports at least 11 people with ties to the Proud Boys have been charged in connection with the Capitol insurrection. Meanwhile, Canada has... in Canada, they have designated Proud Boys as a terrorist organization, describing it as a neo-fascist group that engages in political violence. Canadian Public Safety Minister Bill Blair said Wednesday, Proud Boys, quote, espouse misogynistic, Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, and anti-immigrant and/or white supremacist ideologies, unquote. Here in the United States, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin convened top military and civilian leaders at the Pentagon Wednesday and ordered them to stand down or pause operations to allow commanders to root out white supremacy and right-wing extremism in the ranks. In Wisconsin, prosecutors asked a judge to issue an arrest warrant for Kyle Rittenhouse, the 18-year-old accused of killing 2 people and injuring another during a Black Lives Matter protest in Kenosha last year. Rittenhouse reportedly failed to inform the court of a change of address, a violation of his $2 million bond. In January, Rittenhouse was photographed at a bar in Wisconsin posing with alleged Proud Boys members and flashing a white power hand sign. Rittenhouse was seen drinking beer and wearing a T-shirt that read, "Free as F word," but, well, it says the curse. The UN warned Wednesday the humanitarian situation in the northern Tigray region of Ethiopia could get even worse, and that the rest of the country could become destabilized due to the volatile situation. This comes a day after Tigray opposition groups said at least 52,000 people have been killed since a conflict in the region broke out in November. Some 3 million people have been displaced. Meanwhile, up to 20,000 Eritrean refugees in Tigray are missing after 2 camps were destroyed. The UN says many were abducted and forcibly returned to Eritrea. China is facing widespread condemnation following a BBC report about the mass rape and sexual torture of Uyghur women and other Muslims detained in the province of Xinjiang. The U.S. State Department called the reports deeply disturbing and said any atrocities committed by China should be, quote, met with serious consequences. We'll have more on this story later in the broadcast. We'll speak with a Uyghur poet and teacher who was imprisoned by the Chinese and tortured. And we'll also speak with an anthropologist who's investigated the mass surveillance of Uyghurs. The International Criminal Court has convicted Dominic Ongwen, a former commander of the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda, of war crimes and crimes against humanity in its first conviction of an LRA leader. Ongwen was himself abducted and turned into a child soldier by the rebel group before eventually becoming deputy to LRA commander Joseph Kony. The LRA was most active in Uganda from the mid-90s to 2005. The UN estimates the rebel group killed over 100,000 people and abducted 60,000 children. A new UN report says nearly 1/3 of all prisoners in Afghanistan have been tortured or mistreated. The forms of torture include beating, suffocation, electric shock, as well as reports of enforced disappearances. Over half of the claims in the UN's torture report come from Kandahar province. In other news about Afghanistan, a Congress-appointed bipartisan panel is advising the U.S. slow down its withdrawal from Afghanistan. The panel's report says the May 1st withdrawal goal established in a 2020 agreement between the U.S. and Taliban forces could lead to more unrest and potentially a civil war. Climate activists in France celebrated a historic victory this week after a court ruled the French state failed to take necessary action to fight the climate catastrophe. The case was brought by 4 environmental groups and backed by over 2 million people through an online petition. The French state was ordered to pay a symbolic €1 to each of the 4 groups, while the court reviews other potential steps President Emmanuel Macron's government might be asked to take. The U.S. has extended the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or New START, with Russia, the only remaining nuclear treaty between the 2 countries, which was set to expire Friday. The agreement limits the number of deployed strategic nuclear warheads for each country as a deterrent to a new arms race and nuclear war. The Biden administration reaffirmed its recognition of opposition leader Juan Guaido as Venezuela's president, ruling out talks with the actual president, Nicolas Maduro, who was elected by the Venezuelan people. This is State Department spokesperson Ned Price.
I would expect that our dialogue will be with our like-minded allies and partners, as well as with the National Assembly, Juan Guaido, as the leader chosen by that National Assembly. I would not expect any direct contact with Maduro, again, whom we consider to be a dictator.
The Biden administration said it will continue to impose sanctions on Venezuela, which have crippled the economy. The Center for Economic and Policy Research estimates as many as 40,000 Venezuelans have died due to sanctions. In Columbus, Ohio, former police officer Adam Coy was arrested and charged with murder for the fatal shooting of 47-year-old Andre Hill, an African-American man, after a grand jury indicted Coy Wednesday in the killing. While responding to a non-emergency call in December, then-Officer Coy, who is white, opened fire just seconds after encountering Hill, who was unarmed. Officer Coy was not using his body camera properly at the time, and he failed to administer aid to Hill for several minutes as Hill lay dying. And a damning new report by the groups No More Deaths and Human Rights Coalition finds Border Patrol agents systematically ignore and dismiss reports of missing migrants and obstruct efforts by families and humanitarian groups to assist or find migrants in the harsh Arizona desert. This is Parker Deegan, who works with No More Deaths and is one of the authors of the report.
The agency's systematic neglect towards emergency reports of undocumented people in distress constitutes a state crime of historic proportions. Therefore, we don't advocate for the improvement, expansion, or reform of Border Patrol's supposed humanitarian initiatives. Instead, we call for an immediate end to Border Patrol's role as sole or primary responder to reported emergencies in the borderlands.
The group Humane Borders found 2020 was the deadliest year for migrants crossing the border into Arizona at non-official ports of entry. The group says the remains of 227 migrants were found on the border last year. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. When we come back, we'll speak to Dr. Wafa El-Sadr, an epidemiologist at Columbia University, and why the U.S. should be doing more to help supply the world with COVID vaccines, just like it once did with HIV medications. Stay with us.
Union maid who never was afraid of the goons and the kings and the company pigs and the deputy sheriffs who made the raid. She went to the union hall when meeting it was called, and when those company goons came round, she always stood her ground. Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking with the union. I'm sticking with the union. I'm sticking with the union. Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking with the union. Till the day I die. This union maid was wise to the tricks of company spies. She couldn't be fooled by the company stool. She'd always organize the guys. She always got her way. When she struck for higher pay, she'd show her card to the National Guard, and this is what she'd say. Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking with the union. I'm sticking with the union. I'm sticking with the union. Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking with the union. I'm sticking with the union till the day I die. When this
Union Made by Anne Feeney, the legendary Pittsburgh folk singer, songwriter, and self-described rabble-rouser. She's died of COVID at the age of 69. Anne Feeney died with family and friends at her side. Her song, Have You Been to Jail for Justice, is featured in the documentary This Is What Democracy Looks Like, about the protests that shut down the meeting of the World Trade Organization Summit in Seattle, Washington in 1999. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined remotely by co-host Nermeen Shaikh. Hi, Nermeen.
Hello, Amy, and welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world.
Well, the U.S. death toll from COVID-19 has passed 450,000. Over 3,900 people died of the disease just Wednesday alone. In another major milestone, data gathered by the COVID Tracking Project shows vaccinations in the United States have eclipsed the number of people who have been infected with the coronavirus. More than 27 million have received a first shot, and nearly 6 million have been given both vaccine doses. This comes as the Biden administration says it still expects to reach its target of 100 million vaccines in its first 100 days, and the number of deaths and people hospitalized continues to fall. But the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention Director, Dr. Rochelle Walensky, warned Wednesday new COVID-19 variants may reverse this trend.
Although we have seen declines in cases and admissions and a recent slowing of deaths, cases remain extraordinarily high, still twice as high as the peak number of cases over the summer. And the continued proliferation of variants that likely have increased transmissibility, that spread more easily, threatens to reverse these recent trends.
As multiple new strains of the coronavirus spread across the United States, the government's top infectious disease expert, Dr. Anthony Fauci, said Monday, people must be vaccinated as quickly as possible to stop more mutations from emerging.
Need to get vaccinated when it becomes available as quickly and as expeditiously as possible throughout the country. And the reason for that is that there is a fact that permeates virology, and that is that viruses cannot mutate if they don't replicate.
This comes as health experts warn any vaccination progress in the United States will be threatened without global vaccine equity. For more, we're joined by Dr. Waha El-Sadr, professor of epidemiology and medicine at the Columbia Mailman School of Public Health and director of ICAP at Columbia University. She recently co-authored an op-ed in the New York Times headlined, "The World is Desperate for More COVID Vaccines," that argues 2 decades ago, the U.S. launched a program to help supply the world with HIV medication. It should take a similar approach to COVID. Doctor, welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. I wanted to start with this watershed moment that we are in, facing the race between the vaccines and the virus. Explain what's happening.
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for having me today. I think we are exactly at this watershed moment because what we have is the potential for garnering the benefits of the vaccines we have discovered thus far, while at the same time we're also seeing the growth in terms of the numbers of new COVID cases, as well as also the identification of these new variants, these new mutations in the virus that potentially could threaten the effectiveness of even our vaccines. So I think what this means is that we have to do 2 things at the same time. We need to, as quickly as possible, expand access to the vaccines, both in this country, in the United States, as well as also around the world. That's number 1. And number 2, we must continue to make every effort to stop transmission from one person to the next, because this is exactly what generates these mutations, these new variants. And that must continue to be done by the usual public health preventive measures that we are all familiar with. The physical distancing, the masking is critically important, avoiding large congregations of people, avoiding socializing at this point in time. So I think we have to be working on these 2 pathways. Scale up of vaccines locally and globally, and at the same time do everything we can to stop transmission of the virus.
Dr. El-Sadr, you talked about vaccine access, the importance of vaccine access in this New York Times op-ed, where you point out that it was Dr. Fauci himself regarding the HIV and AIDS virus. It was Dr. Fauci at the time who persuaded then President George W. Bush to start PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief that made AIDS HIV medication accessible to large numbers of people around the world, saving up to 18 million lives, as you write. What is it that you're advocating the Biden administration do to enable access globally to the COVID vaccines in a similar way?
Yes, I think we do have this historic precedent that I think is probably one of people do recognize that PEPFAR, the global HIV program that's supported by the United States government, is probably one of the most successful ever foreign assistance programs that has received bipartisan support for decades now. And I think this is a model that can be emulated at this point in time in recognition of the fact that viruses know no borders, and that what happens in a country in sub-Saharan Africa with regards to COVID, has an impact on what happens right here in our own country. So the model is that the importance of prioritizing the procurement, the support for the development of these vaccines around the world so that they can actually reach the largest numbers of people possible, particularly in low and middle income countries. So it's both making available the vaccines themselves or making available the technology that supports the development of these vaccines. At the same time, also investing their resources to be able to support vaccination programs. We know that you need the vaccines, obviously, but we also need to have effective, large-scale vaccination programs in order to get the benefits of these vaccines anywhere.
Dr. Al-Sadr, you also say in the same piece that the mRNA vaccines, which both Moderna and Pfizer use, are easier and faster to manufacture than most other vaccine technologies. But of course, these vaccines are extremely difficult to transport and to store, given the temperatures at which they have to be kept. Could you talk about what you think? I mean, the Russia vaccine, Sputnik V, has just been shown to have 92% efficacy. There are other vaccines that developing countries are attempting to access, the China vaccine, Sinopharm, Sinovac. How easy or difficult is it, given the technologies those vaccines use, to manufacture and produce and disseminate widely and quickly?
I think in the end, we're going to need really a mix of different types of vaccines, and it depends really on the setting. There are some settings where it is quite feasible to be able to keep some of these mRNA vaccines, availability of freezers, for example, refrigerators, and so on. And then there are other settings where it is going to be very difficult because of the lack of these kinds of resources. So in the end, I think it's going to depend on the setting and the location within different countries and so on. So I do think we need to be flexible. We need to be cognizant of the realities on the ground and do the very best that we can to enable that in the end, countries would have different options, that they can then seek whatever option fits best within their reality and that fits best within their own context. I think there's not going to be one answer, but I think there needs to be work on all fronts to enable ultimately that people from these countries have access to the vaccine, because it is the right thing to do, but it also is in the self-interest of our own country as well.
Dr. Wafa Al-Sadr, can you address the issue of those concerned about the vaccine? A new study has come out today from Monmouth University that says in the United States, maybe half the people plan to get vaccinated as soon as they can, but a quarter say they never will. We see very little information about negative side effects of these vaccines, though millions have gotten them. Would it help people to believe more in the vaccine if we heard about the thousands of, complaints and concerns that people have with the vaccine?
I think that absolutely. I think we are all as public health professionals and researchers, we're very concerned about what has been called vaccine hesitancy, which it could be because simply people don't have the accurate information about the vaccine itself. So that's very important, just disseminating information about the vaccine and how it was developed and what it does and what it doesn't do. I think another aspect of hesitancy sometimes is because of a legacy of mistrust, for example, amongst certain groups of our own population and global populations in terms of mistrust of government, mistrust of research. And for that, we need to engage individuals from these same communities, trusted messengers, trusted champions, who can talk to their peers about what the vaccines do and what they don't do. We also need, at the same time, to also share information as information arises in terms of any side effects from these vaccines and the magnitude of such side effects. I think it's really important to be transmitting the information, thinking about what are the best channels for transmitting the information, and very importantly is being very transparent about the information that we have. We're very fortunate that thus far, with all of the vaccines for which we've seen results, have been, first of all, remarkably effective. They work, and also have been remarkably safe. The safety profile has been very comforting, and I think that's really of great importance.
So why do you think it is, Dr. El-Sadr, that perhaps up to a third of healthcare professionals say they will not take the vaccine? That does not inspire confidence, and what is the reasoning?
There are multiple reasons for this. I think, again, healthcare workers are also part of our society, our community, and there are, again, many people or from certain subsets of our communities, particularly amongst African Americans, for example, Hispanics and Latinx populations in this country, who, because of the legacy, I mentioned the legacy of mistrust and prior abuses in research, are leery of anything that comes from the government, including these very valuable vaccines. And I think it's going to take a lot of work for us to be able to gain their trust and keep sharing the information. But most importantly, beyond the knowledge, it is really reaching people from the same communities who can then talk about their own experiences, why they vaccinated, and then demonstrate to others that it is in their interest and the interest of their families and communities to be vaccinated. It's not going to happen overnight, but we need to be working on this very diligently, engaging with the communities that have these the fear of these vaccines, and so that we can gain their trust. It will take a lot of work, a lot of partnerships, a lot of commitment, and being willing to listen to their concerns and answer their concerns.
And Dr. El-Sadr, as I'm sure you're aware, vaccine hesitancy is not just a problem in the U.S., but also across the world. France has one of the highest rates, but also places like South Africa and Kuwait. So could you talk about how views of vaccination and why views of vaccination have changed in this way, and what the implications are if large numbers of people or even significant numbers of people around the world refuse the vaccine when it's made available to them?
I think that's an issue of globally of great concern. It's like you said, it's not just in the U.S. It's in almost every corner of this globe. And people are, when you ask individuals, they're on a spectrum. There are people who are ready and willing to get vaccinated. As soon as they're eligible, they're going to really be at the front of the line. They're convinced, they're ready to act. And then on the other extreme are people who simply don't believe in vaccines for a variety of different reasons. Vaccines overall, not just this COVID vaccine. And then most people are somewhere in the middle, and they are seeking answers to their questions. They are seeking reassurance. They're looking for others like them to have been vaccinated. And I think we're now focusing on these individuals who are on the spectrum of these people who have concerns, who have issues, who have certain beliefs, and working with them diligently to try to overcome some of the myths they may believe, and also to try, like I said, to engage people whom they trust. This is very important. What I'm seeing now is some of the narratives, storytelling around the vaccines, people who are standing up from some of these same communities and saying, I went and I get vaccinated because I did it for my family. I did it for my community. And that can be a very powerful statement coming from someone from these same communities. communities. And we need to be doing this in the U.S. as well as around the world as well. And I think in this day and age, it's particularly important to do this very actively because, of course, of social media and the ability to disseminate sometimes erroneous information about side effects of vaccines. And I think we need to be very nimble to be able to again respond to some of these erroneous messaging.
Dr. Al-Sadr, I wanted to ask you about the current controversy in the United States. This is CDC Director Dr. Rochelle Walensky speaking during a briefing reporters Wednesday about the reopening of schools and vaccines for teachers.
I would also say that safe reopening of schools is not, that vaccination of teachers is not a prerequisite for safe reopening of schools.
President Biden has said he wants to reopen a majority of K-8 schools in his first 100 days, but during a meeting with teachers' unions last Thursday, Dr. Fauci, director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, said it may not happen.
The goal. That may not happen because there may be mitigating circumstances.
Oh, can you, Dr. Al-Sadr, address this issue of whether parents, teachers, and kids should be concerned about in-person learning and what it means for Dr. Walensky to say, yes, people should go back to school even if teachers are not fully vaccinated?
Well, I think we have data now that are very reassuring. So over the past year, since the beginning of this pandemic, there's been accumulating data that have shown again and again that transmission in schools is not the problem. It is not that schools have been breeding grounds for transmission of COVID-19. This has been shown in a variety of different programs around this country and around the world for a lot of different reasons. One is that we have some data that transmission from children to adults seems to be less efficient than from adults to adults. So that's important. And also that there are data that have shown that the rates of transmission within schools, again, are very limited. Most of the infections amongst teachers and so on and other school personnel have been acquired in the community. They've not been acquired in the schools themselves. So the most important thing is to make sure that the schools are safe, and that means, of course, paying attention to ventilation, to the spacing between the students, to face covering if they're of the right age and can wear a mask, and I think we have the evidence that said that this has kept our schools as safe environments. Certainly. Again, teachers who are involved in classroom instruction, they are part, at least in New York State, they are part of the group that is eligible to get vaccinated. But again, the data overall are quite reassuring about the situation itself of COVID in schools, even without the vaccine. So the vaccine can be an additive protective measure, but it's not necessary to restrict return to school until every not just teacher, but every staff person at a school is vaccinated.
Dr. Wafa Al-Sadr, I want to thank you for being with us, Professor of Epidemiology and Medicine at Columbia's Mailman School of Public Health. We'll link to your piece in the New York Times, "The World is Desperate for More COVID Vaccines." When we come back, we look at China's crackdown on Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities in Xinjiang province as reports emerge of mass rapes and sweeping surveillance. Stay with us.
Grandfather sang to me, the weeping woman spoke, down beneath the trees is wisdom of the old. I seen plenty of disrespect for the knowledge of the land. It's my people I see lost in other people's hands. Everybody's hoping to see you at the door, taking care of people you don't know, staying inside in their homes, whispering to the dark
Dark Eyes by Lila Downs. To see our interview with her and her performance in our studio, go to democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Shaikh. China is facing widespread condemnation following a BBC report about the mass rape and sexual torture of Uyghur women and other Muslims detained in the province of Xinjiang. Several former prisoners spoke on camera to the BBC's Matthew Hill. A warning to our audience, these clips contain disturbing descriptions of sexual abuse.
Tarsanai Zaiwudan is reliving a story she can barely bring herself to tell. She was held at one of Xinjiang's so-called re-education camps. These satellite images show the site where Tarsanai says she was held, sharing a cell with 13 other women with a bucket for a toilet. And she's haunted by one image, masked men coming down a camp corridor like this one after midnight.
They were 3 men, not one, but 3. They did whatever evil their mind could think of, and they didn't spare any part of my body, biting it to the extent that it was disgusting to look at. They didn't just rape, they were barbaric. They had bitten all over my body.
By the BBC, talked about the mass rapes of detained women in Xinjiang province.
Many former camp inmates flee to Istanbul. Some talk of having to choose between punishment or being complicit in these crimes.
I worked 6 months as a cleaning worker for the women. Han Chinese men would pay money to have their pick of the pretty young inmates.
This was the first time Gulzira has told anyone the full extent of what she says she was forced to do.
My job is to remove their clothes and then handcuff them on their beds so they cannot move.
China claimed the BBC report was, quote, wholly without factual basis. Meanwhile, The Intercept has obtained a massive police surveillance database used by the Chinese government to monitor residents of Xinjiang. The database confirms China collects millions of text messages, phone contacts, and call records, as well as biometric data from Muslim minorities in Xinjiang. Information collected is used to decide who to detain. China has admitted it runs a series of what it calls free vocational training centers, but critics have likened them to internment camps. In January, the outgoing Trump administration accused China of carrying out genocide and halted the importation of cotton and tomatoes from Xinjiang. President Joe Biden's Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, has agreed with that assessment. To talk more about the crackdown in Xinjiang, we're joined by 2 guests. Abduweli Ayub is a Uyghur linguist and poet. He was detained for 15 months for running a Uyghur language kindergarten in Xinjiang. He's joining us from Bergen in Norway. And joining us from Seattle, Washington, Darren Byler is with us, an anthropologist at the University of Colorado Boulder. He's the author of 2 forthcoming books, one on Uyghurs and one on technologies of re-education in China and around the world. Darren Byler, if we could begin with you. This massive database that has been unveiled as China refuses to admit this total surveillance state for the Muslim minority, the Uyghurs, in Xinjiang. Explain what we have learned and how they're surveilling the population.
Well, great. It's an honor to be here. The database that we've uncovered through the work done at The Intercept is 52 gigabytes of thousands of internal police documents coming from the city of Urumqi. They're dated 2017 to 2019. And what they show us at a granular level is the way that Muslim institutions, the mosques, the family structure is being targeted by a surveillance regime and an accompanying police force. Religious activity has almost ground to a halt completely. There's in one report they said 160 elderly people still go to the mosque, but 80,000 others have stopped attending. They also talk about families being visited by government officials and being placed on watch lists, particularly the families of people that have been sent to the camps. And it's giving us really granular level view of communities that have really been torn apart, of people that have been sent to these camps. It ranges from 10% of the population to higher. It's a really devastating material that's showing us the extent of the damage, the way that this entire society is being targeted with a program of elimination and some forms of replacement, a kind of colonial regime.
And Abdulwali Ayub, one of the most disturbing revelations in this BBC report about the torture and sexual abuse of detainees in these internment camps in Xinjiang is that Uyghur detainees themselves, as we just heard in the clip we played, that detainees themselves were forced to play a role in the mass rapes. Now, you were arrested and held for 15 months between 2013 and 2014. Could you explain what you witnessed and what you were accused of, why you were arrested?
I was arrested because I had a mother language kindergarten in Kashgar first, and then our capital city, Urumqi. And because of my mother language kindergarten, I was arrested and then detained 15 months. And during the time, I faced very incredible situation, very brutal, and it's rape. And second, it's disturbing and very devastating is torture with the electric shock and with the humiliation, with the denounce of the religion and the denounce of the identity. For example, that during that time in the Spring Festival, Chinese Spring Festival, we have to eat the dumpling. At that time, I suspect what is inside, and I asked, and then I asked it's halal or haram, that thing, and then I was punished. I was chained in 7 days. I think it's what's happening there is inhuman, and the target is the Uyghur, and because of their religion and because of their culture, and the government, the mainly purpose is force them to denounce the religion, force them to denounce the language and the cultural practice.
Darren, could you talk about the fact that the Chinese government has been accused both of committing cultural genocide, but also profiting from the forced labor of Muslim minority communities? Talk about the connection between forced labor connected to Western supply chains and consumers, particularly in Xinjiang's role of producing over 80% of China's cotton, and also the region being rich in other natural resources, as you said earlier, including natural gas and oil.
Now, we have to go back to the 1990s and 2000s, which is when China was opening up to the West, was becoming a manufacturer for the world, and had a real need to obtain raw materials like oil, natural gas, cotton, and eventually tomatoes from this region. And the Uyghur region, which is immense, it's the size of Alaska, has around 20% of Chinese oil and natural gas. And so in the 90s and 2000s, they began to send settlers into the Uyghur majority areas in the south part of the region to begin to extract those resources. And so there you're kind of seeing a sort of classic internal colony that's being used by the nation. Over time, an antagonism really developed between the local population, this indigenous native Uyghur population in southern Xinjiang, between them and those settlers. Because the settlers began to take over the institutions, the cost of living began to rise, and so there was protests over land being taken. There was police brutality in response to those protests, and then there was more protests, and it turned into a sort of a cycle of violence. In the 2000s, a rhetoric of terrorism entered the discussion following 9/11 here in the U.S., and that was then attached to this Uyghur population because they're Muslim. Although most of the conflict really had nothing to do with their religious practice, it was about injustice. That's how it was framed. Moving forward into the present, as this camp system has been built out as a way of targeting and really transforming the population, who they feel like in order to integrate them, they need to retrain them to teach them not to practice Islam and to speak Chinese. That program has now been accompanied by a factory regime that takes advantage of the industrial scale agriculture that's been developed along with the settlement of southern Xinjiang, and begins to produce textiles for the world. 25% or so of cotton comes from China. So it means that it's very difficult to buy products that don't have this cotton in them. Sometimes it's just simply grown in the region, and other times it's now actually being, the final product is being produced in the region. The factories themselves are associated with the camps, or in some cases they're nearby the camps. The workers that are sent into these spaces have no choice but to go. If they refuse, they're labeled extremists and then can be sent to the camps. And so the threat of the camp is really holding people in place, along with all of the surveillance systems that are also monitoring all of their movements.
Professor Byler, you wrote a piece in The Guardian headlined, "Why are U.S. companies buying tech from Chinese firms that spy on Muslims?" Can you name the companies that are involved?
I can't name all of them. There's around 1,400 firms that are working in Xinjiang to build a kind of digital enclosure system. They have different tasks within that system. But I'll name a few. The largest companies in China, what they call the AI champions, national champions, are deeply invested in this situation. They're the camera companies, the software companies. Hikvision and Dahua are two of the largest camera manufacturers in the world. And the op-ed you mentioned talks about one of them, how Amazon and IBM were buying these cameras from one of these companies in order to begin to track coronavirus here in the U.S. Other companies like SenseTime, MugV, E2, which are these artificial intelligence companies, and also now sometimes building cameras, are also involved in this situation. And they're making component parts of things you might buy, many of them made in China. So, for instance, MugV is also partnered with a cell phone company to do the face recognition camera or the phone access system. You know how you can scan your face and then it opens the phone for you. So there's lots of applications that come out of the surveillance systems that are built in Xinjiang and then become these other products in other locations. And so we have to be really careful if we want to be ethical consumers in being sure that the companies we are buying things from are not also participating in this sort of genocidal violence in Northwest China.
Abdulwali, you are working on writing a memoir of your time in prison. Could you tell us a little bit about that? What is it that you document about your experience in the prisons? What conditions were like there? Whether you were able to speak to other prisoners while you were there? And what you witnessed and learned about what had been happening and what continues to happen in these camps?
Yes, I almost finished my book, Prisoners Made in China. And because I stayed in Kashgar detention center and then in Urumqi, 3 different detention centers. So I'm very familiar with those detention center and detention system. And in my book, I talked about what kind of torture in interrogation room. Second is what was happening in the cell. And the third is what's the torturing methods in the cell, and what's the guard's method to force prisoners to confess, and how the system work in detention center. And I describe from as a prisoner's perspective, and I describe it from the beginning to the end, that 15 months. And especially I focus on the guards and prisoners relationship, and the guards and the interrogation. For example, I can make you one example that guards there, they help the interrogation, because if there's a competition between the interrogators and the guards, and if the guard get that confess, and he will be promoted. If the interrogator get the confess, that one have promotion more. In that case, the two kind of guys are competing to force prisoners to confess. And in my book, I describe this, for example, that prison guards, they use hashish, and they use heroin, and they use sexual abuse to confess, force prisoners confess, to tell what they want. Because in detention system, the guards and the interrogators, they mainly focus on confession, because they want the people who are living there to tell that we are criminals, we are sick, and we are problem makers. They want that answer. They don't want any detail. They want, yes, they force the people to answer the question yes or no. The story is already made up. Only the a game is playing there is yes or no.
Abdouali, if you can tell us how you ultimately left Xinjiang, how you got out of the country, we're talking to you in Norway now, what has happened to your family, and how they use cell phones integral to monitoring everything people do, gathering information from those phones, requiring that you have them.
Yes, after I released from the camp, I faced a big problem that I have to keep my cell phone on 24 hours. And if I visit my friend, and because we are together, and I was already blacklisted, and my friend become blacklisted person. In that case, my friend was in danger. So I lived in that surveillance system, and it's not possible to me to live further. That's why I faced escape. I escaped the country because of this, because of the surveillance.
And Abdouali, in addition to the surveillance that's carried out on Uyghurs in China, there have been reports that the Chinese government is also tracking Uyghurs living outside. Are you concerned about your own safety? And do you still have family in Xinjiang or anywhere else in China?
Yes, still we are in free world, but we are under the pressure. For example, I went to Chinese embassy in 2016, September. At the time, the Chinese embassy in Ankara asked me to add the WeChat, to download WeChat and add them. After that, the Chinese state security in Urumqi called me immediately. We are here watching you, and what are you doing and what are you working on? We know clearly. So you should listen to us. We reach you wherever you are. It's a psychological pressure. It's only me. Like I'm living in Bergen right now, and I know we have around 200 Uyghurs are, and about 20 Uyghurs called by Chinese embassy in Oslo. So we are in free world, but we are under pressure right now.
Abdouali Ayoub, we want to thank you so much for joining us on Democracy Now!, telling your own life experience. Uyghur linguist who set up a kindergarten and ultimately was imprisoned for 15 months. Also a poet. Thanks so much for being with us. Darren Byler, anthropologist at the University of Colorado Boulder, speaking to us from Seattle, Washington. And that does it for our broadcast. A very happy birthday to Hugh Gran. Democracy Now! Is produced with Renee Feltz, Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Libby Rainey, Nermeen Shaikh, Maria Taracena, Carla Wills, Tammy Warrenoff, Charina Nadura, Sam Alcoff, Tay-Marie Astudio, John Hamilton, Rabi Karen, Honey Massoud, Adriano Contreras. Our general manager is Julie Crosby. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Miriam Barnard, Paul Powell, Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, Hugh Grant, Dennis Moynihan, David Prude, and Dennis McCormick. Please stay safe. Wear a mask. Wear two. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Shaikh.